Okay, so having now looked at three separate models, the Ricardian model, specific factors, and Heckscher-Ohlin model, we now want to sort of, in this topic, we are going to use what we call the standard trade model, and it has elements, if you like, of all of them, or we can use this model to describe aspects of the other three models that we've looked at. But we're going to use this mainly to concentrate on the demand side. We are going to talk about supply and the production of the goods and the trade in those goods. But here we're going to look a little bit more at the demand side. So we can think of this standard trade model as, I'm not sure if summary is the right word, but certainly it encapsulates a lot of the material that we looked in the previous models. And in this video, at least, we're just going to look at the idea of the difference between production and consumption. So therefore, looking at the demand side and looking how we can then use that to construct essentially a relative world demand and supply model. So this framework here in this standard trade model is more general. We can think of, if you like, the Ricardian model, the specific factors model, and the Heckscher-Ohlin model as sort of specific situations that have certain assumptions that we can use, that we can still use through this model. So, for example, the Ricardian model obviously only had one factor of production, so we could do that through this model, but restrict it to just one factor of production. The specific factors model is often used in terms of short-run things. Remember, the specific factor is fixed to the particular production of a good, and in the short run that may actually be true. Whereas the Heckscher-Ohlin model, which allows this kind of substitution between them and allows these factors of production to move between sectors of the economy, can be thought of more as a long-run type of situation. Nevertheless, these models, they do share a number of features, even though they're different in terms of the assumptions that we have imposed on them. So certainly they all have a production possibility frontier. All right, and that summarizes obviously the sort of supply side of our model, in the sense that, of course, the production possibilities, what firms can do, and that obviously relates to supply. And we also, in some of the other models, we looked at the world relative demand and a world relative supply, with the world relative supply that kind of lies between our two countries. So that gives rise to the gains from trade. And then, as a consequence of that, obviously, different the distribution of income across the groups, across the sectors, and across the countries. So these models that we've studied so far can sort of be viewed as special cases of a more general model, and that's the one that we want to sort of focus on now. We're going to keep many of the assumptions that we had before. Let me just get my pen. Okay, we're going to assume things like constant returns to scale. We're going to focus on this production possibility frontier. Still going to be bowed out, so it reflects the changing opportunity costs, heterogeneity within factor groups, and so on. Okay. And again, we're just going to use a simple example with food and cloth. So let's have a look at this, how this develops. So we've done this before. We've got cloth on the horizontal, food production on the vertical axis. At the moment, we don't have trade, and we've said that, okay, well, we've got these ISO value lines, okay, in terms of the value of output production. So we've got, and we've done this previously, so I can go through this relatively quickly, where we've got each of these ISO value lines represents a value of output, and so that's the price of the, say, food multiplied by the quantity being produced of food, and the price of cloth multiplied by the quantity of cloth being used. We can rearrange that. We get the slope, which is this here, slope of the ISO value line, and then, of course, that value of output increases obviously as you move further out to the right. In other words, as quantity of cloth and food increases, given a relative price. In other words, given the slope. So you can get V0, V1, V2, etc. Right? We know that, say, for example, V3 here is not possible. It's unattainable. We can't produce that quantity any of those quantities along that line of food and cloth because we don't have the resources for it. We know that the optimal point then is X, where the ratio of the or the slope of the production possibility frontier is equal to the slope of the ISO value line, which reflects the opportunity cost of production, is equal to the relative prices. So again, this sort of stuff we've done before. What we want to look at here is what happens if the slope changes. In other words, what happens if relative prices change. Here I've got obviously the price or the relative price of cloth increasing. It's getting steeper. Okay, the price of cloth is either going up and or the price of food is going down. That gives us this new point of tangency here at Y, and you can see that in terms of production, and again, remember we're really thinking here in terms of supply only. We're not thinking about consumers and consumption and that kind of thing. You can see that producers are going to produce more cloth because the price of cloth has increased, and the less food. Oops, that's a really straight arrow, isn't it? The quantity of food being produced is going to decline. So that's what we know is going to happen in terms of our production. Now, from this, of course, we can get this our relative supply curve, because what we've shown here is that, so using these sort of numbers here, or not numbers, notation here, when the relative price of cloth to food is at this, we can see that the relative production is going to be QC1, QF1. Okay, so that gives us 1 point of supply, relative supply. When the price of cloth, remember, went up, and we're on this new ISO value line here with the higher price, okay, higher relative price of cloth, the relative quantity being produced, remember, the quantity of cloth increased, the quantity of food decreased, and so the relative quantities increased. It gives us another line, and so this gives us our relative supply curve. So that's part of this. That's one part of the 1/2 of the market, if you like, in terms of this, in terms of our model. Okay, but what about demand? And this is what we want to spend a bit of time on in this video. So some quick notation. Again, this D means consumption. So we've got Q for production, D for consumption. And we got sort of the same constraints at the moment, production and consumption. These ISO value lines, therefore, for consumption are the same. You can think of these as our budget constraints in terms of, if you can think back to second year micro, for example, we've got our indifference curve model. We've got our indifference curves that represent sort of satisfaction, and we've got our budget constraint, which reflects both the prices of the good and our available income that we've got to spend. And so we have sort of looked at this before on a previous topic, but here we want to take it sort of a step further, if you like. So what we're going to show here in a minute anyway is that obviously society can be better off. And when we say better off, we mean on a higher indifference curve with trade than under autarky. Okay, so let's go back to this model again. We're going to start off at a point here like X. Now, in terms of, and these, IC 1, 2, and 3 obviously represent the indifference curves of consumers in this economy. As soon as we talk about this, we're talking about what their preferences are in terms of consumption, remember. And so you can see that given this budget constraint, the optimal point here is Z, okay, on this IC3. Now you'll notice here that this is obviously outside of the production possibilities. Okay, so again, we're going outside of our production possibilities. And of course, what we've got here then is we've got, you can see, if you look here in terms of food, there's the consumption of food, there's the production of food. And so that's obviously going to be imports. If we're consuming more than we're producing, by definition, it has to be imports. Conversely, if you have a look here, also at Z, if we look down here in terms of cloth, there's the production of cloth and there's the consumption. So what we don't consume ourselves, we obviously export. Yeah. So again, in a previous topic, we looked at how this is bounded, and this is true. We don't have borrowing and things like that. So the imports must be able to be paid for by the exports. So that's no different to what we've looked at previously. Okay, so looking at this new point here, Z, which is our optimal point when we allow for trade, imports and exports. Now we obviously want to look at what happens when prices change. Essentially what we're doing here is we're trying to develop a relative demand curve, because we're focusing on the consumption bit. And we can also see here what happens in terms of trade when prices change. So I'm going to, well, I've said here, and if prices change. So here I've got the price of cloth again, or the relative price of cloth increasing. Yeah. So again, we're going to have this steeper curve here. Now the optimal point now in terms of production is, as we would expect, with the price increasing, the producers of cloth are willing to supply more, produce more, and in terms of the production of food, that's going to decrease. So when relative prices move in favour of cloth, we're going to get an increase in the production of cloth, decrease in the production of food. So that's the first thing. Again, that's a supply side thing. What about in terms of consumption? Well, you can see here that we're now, or the economy now, or the consumers in the economy are now able to move to a higher indifference curve. I've labelled that IC4. Now, of course, I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a sec, but of course, where this ultimately is will depend in large part on income and substitution effects. Yeah? So this is just one possibility here that I've drawn, but we'll work with this. So this optimal point here, this new optimal point here, is at point Y. Okay, you can see here. So this is our optimal consumption of food, which is that DF2. And down here, you can see that the way that I've done it is that as the price of cloth increases, the consumption, or the demand, decreases. Right? People who are consuming the good want fewer of it. The relative price of food has gone down, of course, and so the consumption of food, the demand for food, has risen. What does this mean in terms of trade? Well, you can see now that imports have increased significantly. Here's the production of food, which fell. But as the production falls, because it's less attractive for firms, the decrease in the price, of course, is more attractive to consumers. So imports rise significantly. You can also see that exports have risen. Now, remember, they're not rising one for one. Depends on the price change. What we can say is that these exports will be able to pay for these imports. Yeah. So the bottom line is imports increase significantly, and exports also increase. As I said before, there's two effects at work here: the income and substitution effects. And you could have, for example, I'm not going to draw it here, but you could have a point of equilibrium somewhere here where you actually do get a slight increase in the consumption of cloth. But again, this depends on which of these effects dominates. Yeah. If you want a recap on that, go back to second year micro and look at those income and substitution effects. So bottom line is, here we can use what we've just done in all of this, both on the supply side with the production, and the demand side with the consumption, to plot this out. So again, what we've got here, we've got a relative price and we've got relative quantity. So based on trying to keep to the same sort of thing as the previous diagram, we know that the relative supply curve, which we plotted out a couple of slides ago, is going to increase. So in other words, it's positively sloped, and the relative demand curve is downward sloping. As the price of cloth, or it doesn't matter which way you go, but as the price of cloth, relative price of cloth increases, remember the demand for, therefore the consumption of cloth declined. So we can think of this as this original point here where consumption equals production. There's no trade. I'm not going to go back to the slide, but you can go and have a look at it. Remember when the relative price of cloth increased, we started to get trade. We got, oh, no, come back. I should have plotted these. So you've got here the demand. That's kind of the consumption, if you like. And the production And so this is where we start to get exports. Yeah. So in terms of cloth anyway, remember we got exports. So the supply, the production was greater than the consumption. Yeah. And then of course this is going to widen, get greater as that relative price of cloth increases further and further. Okay, so that's a very quick explanation, if you like, of how we look at this issue through the standard trade model. It's quite simple in terms of the production. That's the normal production possibility stuff with the quantity of cloth and food, etc. And just in a general sense now introducing or reaffirming, if you like, the idea of these indifference curves and showing the consumption element as well, so that we can essentially get this whole market, the world market of relative demand and relative supply, into our diagram. In the next, we're going to take this model obviously a little bit further, and that's the subject of the next part of this topic.